The body was found hunched like a question mark, spine twisted, skull cleaved open like a desecrated chalice. Beneath the grey soil of a forgotten car park in Leicester, the bones lay not in state but in shame. Crouched, compacted, as though even the grave refused to stretch out for a king. He had been buried with neither ceremony nor care, crammed into a too small trench, hands possibly bound, stripped of regality, stripped of identity, stripped of humanity. This was not a tomb, it was a disposal. His skeleton bore the language of butchery. The blade had entered his skull from behind, peeling open the bone in a crescent of annihilation. Another slash across the lower jaw shattered the regal silence, as if someone had tried to carve the royal tongue from its roots. On his back, punctures of a halberd told of soldiers stabbing downward as he knelt, helpless, perhaps screaming. It was not a death. It was an unmaking. And even in death, the whispers did not end. Crookback, tyrant, child-killer, the villain playwrights adored. The hunchback butcher of boys in the tower. His name became theatre, his memory twisted to fit a crown of shadows. But the truth of Richard III's death, its violence, its degradation, its grotesque intimacy, was not poetry. It was closer to a sacrificial rite, executed not just in body, but in myth, in meaning, in marrow. We know this is dark. We know this hurts to imagine. But we tell this story because we love you, and the truth, however painful, is part of loving the past. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee, and let's get started. He was born into a world writhing in the agony of power devouring itself. England in the mid-15th century was not a kingdom. It was a wound. The Wars of the Roses, that internecine struggle between the red bloom of Lancaster and the white of York, turned the realm into a battlefield and the throne into a guillotine. It was amid this storm that Richard Plantagenet was born in 1452, the 12th child of Richard, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville. From the moment of his first breath, he was not cradled in peace, but in ambition sharpened to a blade. As a child, he watched his father's head mounted on a pike after the Battle of Wakefield. His brother Edward would become King Edward IV, not through inheritance, but through conquest. Richard, still a boy, was dispatched to live at the court of the Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker, where loyalty was always conditional and safety was illusion. From an early age, he understood that blood was currency, that survival required silence, and that kingship was not bestowed, it was seized. His body marked him. Whether the curvature of his spine was pronounced from birth or sculpted over time by illness or strain, it became more than deformity. It became prophecy. In a culture that worshipped symmetry and feared irregularity, the crookedness of his back whispered of unnaturalness. Some saw him as touched by divinity's rejection, others by fate's cruelty. His frame would be used against him long after his death, a symbol of the twisted soul imagined by his enemies. Still, Richard served his brother faithfully, blood-stained loyalty his constant garment. He fought beside Edward IV in exile and in triumph, distinguishing himself at battles like Barnet and Tewkesbury with brutal clarity. He was no distant noble. He was a soldier, intimate with death, fluent in the language of slaughter, and committed wholly to the preservation of Yorkist supremacy. He was rewarded with vast lands in the north, governing as Duke of Gloucester with austere diligence. To some, he brought justice. To others, he was the cold wind that preceded storm. But it was upon Edward IV's sudden death in 1483 that the tide began to fester. The late king's heir, the boy Prince Edward V, was only 12. A nation's breath caught in its throat. Richard, named Lord Protector, moved swiftly, not with gentleness, but with the precision of a man who knew delay was death. The boy king was taken to the Tower of London for his protection, and soon his younger brother joined him. They would never emerge. Richard's coronation was swift, conducted with all the trappings of divine right, but the throne upon which he sat was jagged with whispers. The disappearance of the princes darkened the air. Officially, he was crowned as England's rightful king. In taverns and courts alike, he was whispered to be a usurper, a fratricide, a murderer of innocence. Whether or not he orchestrated the deaths of his nephews remains an unsettled question, drowned in centuries of speculation and revision. But the stain never faded. He ruled for only 2 years. During that time, Richard III enacted laws that suggested a man deeply aware of his image. He sought to stabilize land disputes, to protect the rights of subjects, to ease burdens on the poor. And yet, none of these deeds outshouted the myth. The shadow of the Tower stretched longer than his reforms. Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian claimant, exiled and bred on vengeance, returned to English soil in 1485. His claim to the throne was tenuous, his lineage thin, but his promise to marry Elizabeth of York, Richard's niece, united both houses in the minds of the weary public. When their forces clashed at Bosworth Field, it was not merely a military battle. It was the theatre of England's future. Richard entered that field not as a coward hiding behind knights, but as a king charging directly into the jaws of death. His crown rested upon his helmet as he carved his path toward Tudor himself. 3 horses died beneath him. He slew Henry's standard-bearer with his own hand. He came within moments, heartbeats of reaching his enemy. But history does not reward ferocity alone. The tide turned. Encircled, betrayed by a supposed ally in Lord Stanley, Richard fell, his skull cleaved, his body desecrated. But in that final hour, he fought not as Shakespeare's caricatured devil, but as a man fully consumed by the machinery he once operated. There was no retreat, no plea, no surrender. Thus ended the last English king to die in battle. The age of chivalric monarchy was extinguished beneath the hooves and halberds of Bosworth. What followed was a burial not befitting a sovereign, but a discardment. And what survived was not the man, but the myth. The crown weighs heavier when it is worn in suspicion. For Richard III, the coronation was not a moment of exaltation. It was the beginning of a slow suffocation. From the instant the crown touched his head, it burned like an accusation. He had seized power amidst whispers and grief, flanked by the silence of 2 missing princes. Their laughter vanished like breath upon a mirror. Though no body was ever produced, the absence was more damning than proof. The Tower stood still and ominous, a stone reliquary of royal disappearance. He ruled a kingdom that recoiled at his touch. Even as he traveled the countryside dispensing justice and favors, murmurs swirled like flies around a corpse. England was exhausted, battered by generations of war, but it could not rest beneath a king whose rise felt unnatural. The populace did not see a reformer. They saw the man who had stepped over the corpses of children. Whether Richard orchestrated their deaths or not became irrelevant. His very survival depended upon their permanent silence. It is a cruel irony that the louder he tried to justify himself, the louder the silence around the Tower became. Within the walls of his court, the atmosphere grew airless. Paranoia is a poison that drips, not floods. It seeps into dreams, into glances, into the unspoken language of advisers whose words begin to sound rehearsed, whose eyes linger a moment too long. Richard had grown up watching loyalty dissolve in real time, his father beheaded, his brother betrayed, alliances shattered like glass underfoot. Now, on the throne, he trusted few, and perhaps not even himself. For all his efforts to present strength, Richard's rule was shadowed by a gnawing fear that his reign was not consecrated, but cursed. Sleep would not have come easily. If it did, it came drenched in visions. The bloodied heads of kin, the shrill cries of the princes locked away, the sword crashing against his skull in prophetic reverse. He had stood unshaken in battlefields, but the throne offered no such clarity. There was no enemy to strike, only suspicion to endure. Every courtier's bow carried the shape of betrayal, every document he signed, a thread in a web tightening around him. His body, too, became a reflection of this unraveling. The spinal curvature that had long marked him as different became, in his own mind, a divine branding. Medieval belief tethered the body to the soul. Deformity was not just physical, but moral. To be bent was to be broken by God's will. And as whispers of his supposed monstrosity echoed, Richard must have begun to internalize the image crafted by others. The man who had once commanded battlefields with iron certainty now found himself increasingly isolated, increasingly performing kingship as though it were a costume sewn from denial. He traveled often, not out of confidence, but necessity. The road offered movement, distraction, a semblance of control. Stationary monarchs invite conspiracy, but each new city brought with it faces that remembered the missing boys. Clerics who hedged their blessings, lords who kissed his ring while clenching daggers behind their backs. Loyalty, in England, had become a fickle fiction. The nobility who had raised him could just as easily pull him down. The public, seduced by legend more than law, looked to Henry Tudor as a mythic redeemer, despite his foreignness and untested mettle. It is in this atmosphere that Richard began to fracture. The records speak of decrees, of parliaments, of movements across the realm, but beneath them lies a silent hemorrhage of the soul. The trauma of survival had calcified into rigidity. Every word he spoke had to be weighed. Every night the weight of the crown returned. He saw plots in shadows. He heard treachery in echoes. His trust narrowed to a handful of men, and even they could not pierce the growing veil of isolation wrapping around his psyche like a burial shroud stitched before death. He began to overcorrect, tightening his grip on governance. Legal reforms, progressive, even visionary, began to pour forth. Courts were restructured, corruption curtailed, the rights of the commons guarded with unusual zeal. And yet, these actions did not mend the image already affixed to his name. To his detractors, mercy felt like manipulation, justice like camouflage. No act of goodness could erase the imagined screams from the tower. His every attempt at redemption only deepened the suspicion that he sought to launder a crime too vast for pardon. Even his physical presence became suspect. Chroniclers described him with a fixation bordering on obsession, his uneven shoulders, his thin frame, his eyes too sharp to be trusted. He did not embody the medieval ideal of the robust, broad-chested sovereign. Instead, he was seen as spectral, more spirit than man, a figure carved from secrets and sleeplessness. It was not his deformity that condemned him, but how it was weaponized. The crooked spine became allegory. The limping gait became metaphor. The king was not merely flawed. He was unnatural. By the summer of 1485, he was cornered not by armies, but by inevitability. He had tried to outpace myth with law. He had tried to drown memory with motion. But history is not a tide that retreats. Rumors coalesced into rebellion. Henry Tudor landed on English shores with a foreign army and a domestic cause. Richard, seasoned in war, could read the battlefield, but not the theatre. He did not see that his own image had long been sacrificed, that his opponents needed only to survive while the legend of his guilt marched ahead. He prepared for Bosworth not only as a commander, but as a man whose world had congealed into inevitability. His plans were precise. His charge would be direct. There would be no room for betrayal if he could reach the heart and kill it. But even that clarity bore desperation. The child who had grown amidst executions, the youth shaped in the fog of war, the man crowned in scandal, now stood against the horizon not as monarch, but as martyr in the making. He would not die quietly. But by the time his sword was raised, the story had already been written, and it was not one he authored. The air over Bosworth Field was dense and suffocating, heavy with the musk of sweat, blood, and the acrid smoke of distant fires. The sun hung low, a molten orb reluctant to set on the last flicker of a fractured rain. The land itself seemed to recoil beneath the thunderous march of soldiers, the steady drumbeat of war echoing like a funeral dirge for a dying monarchy. Richard III rode at the forefront, a king not merely on a battlefield, but on the precipice of oblivion, where the ritual of death was to be enacted in grotesque, merciless detail. His helmet, crowned with the jagged emblem of a boar, the emblem of his house, gleamed with the last flickers of daylight, a cruel mockery of sovereignty. Around him, the banners of York fluttered fitfully, half-hearted in the breathless anticipation of doom. The weight of his armor pressed against his bent spine, a physical burden mirroring the invisible chains that tethered him to a collapsing legacy. Horses snorted and pawed the earth, their hooves hammering out a rhythm like the heartbeat of a corpse. The battle commenced with the savage poetry of steel on steel, screams carved into the tapestry of war. Richard's sword sliced through air and flesh alike, his fury untamed even as the tide turned against him. 3 horses were slain beneath his charge, each fall a morbid testament to his unyielding will. The field became a theater of carnage where the king, alone and surrounded, fought not for glory, but for survival. The sound of halberds puncturing armor, the sickening crunch of bone under boot, and the distant roar of soldiers locked in mortal combat formed a grim symphony. At the heart of this maelstrom, Richard's world contracted. His mind, once a crucible of strategy, fragmented into moments of raw sensation, the shudder of a blade striking his helm, the splash of blood upon his cheek, the wet thud of dying horses around him. His breaths were shallow and ragged, his muscles burning with exertion and pain. Every movement was a desperate bid against the darkness gathering like a shadow at his back. The very earth seemed stained with the rot of his fate, as though the soil itself sought to reclaim him. Then came the final, brutal crescendo. Encircled by enemy knights, his allies faltering and the banners of York slipping from hopeful to hopeless, Richard was thrown from his mount. The fall was not graceful, but a collapse into the maw of death. His body hit the ground with the sound of a breaking throne, and the air was ripped by the clamor of men descending like vultures. They did not move to capture, but to annihilate. Their weapons were no longer instruments of war, but tools of dismemberment. His spine, already bowed and vulnerable, became a grotesque canvas of violence. A halberd plunged downward, rending through plate and flesh, snapping ribs like dry twigs. The king knelt in agony, a fallen god stripped of divinity, while blades tore at his shoulders, slicing sinew and muscle in cruel dissection. His cries, if any escaped, were swallowed by the roar of the crowd and the clash of steel. The grotesque spectacle became a ritualized unmaking, a public autopsy of a man whose body betrayed the crown. But the most terrible wounds were not merely physical. His skull, that fragile reliquary of power and identity, was shattered with a precision that bespoke personal hatred. The blow cleaved open his cranium from behind, a crescent-shaped fracture that peeled back bone and brain as if to sever the memory of kingship itself. Another wound, jagged and brutal, split his lower jaw, silencing forever the voice that had commanded armies and courtiers alike. These were not haphazard blows of battle. They were acts of symbolic erasure. The ground beneath him, soaked with mingled blood and earth, became an altar of humiliation. His body, once encased in the regalia of monarch, was now reduced to fragmented flesh and broken bone, a grotesque relic for those who wished to witness the downfall of tyranny. Men spat and jeered, trampling the fallen king with boots heavy as condemnation. The sword that would have delivered a clean death was denied. Instead, the halberd's cruel barbs tore him apart in slow, methodical agony. The crowd's reaction was a perverse theater of collective catharsis. Some cheered with savage joy, intoxicated by the spectacle of a king brought low. Others looked away, eyes wide with horror, as though witnessing the death of not just a man, but a fractured era. The air hung thick with the stench of gore and desperation. The battlefield, soaked in the mingled essence of ambition and ruin, became a stage where the ritual of power's collapse was writ in blood. After the king's death, the treatment of his body was itself an act of symbolic annihilation. His corpse was stripped bare, the fine silks and armor torn away as if to expose the man beneath the myth. The spine's unnatural curvature was laid bare, a grotesque signifier of his cursed reign. The body was then hastily buried beneath a humble chapel floor at Greyfriars in Leicester. No tomb, no monument, only a forgotten grave. The burial was a denial of sovereignty, an erasure of memory, a body cast aside like broken flesh. It was centuries before the earth would yield his remains again, and when did, the macabre truth was laid bare. The skeleton bore the scars of a death more brutal than the annals dared confess. The cleaved skull, the halberd wounds, the crushed vertebrae, they told a story of a king undone not by mercy, but by precision. The final act was a spectacle of degradation, a ritual sacrifice to political necessity and public vengeance. This death was not mercy. This was precision. This was theater. This was the dark liturgy of power's demise. The news of Richard's demise rippled across England like a poison-laden tide, swift and corrosive. Yet the silence that followed his brutal death was as telling as any proclamation. There were no grand funerals, no laments sung from cathedral steps. The once mighty monarch was consigned to obscurity, his body interred beneath nondescript stone, swallowed by the dust of a city eager to forget. The erasure was total, a deliberate unmaking that stretched beyond flesh to memory itself. In London's courts and taverns alike, whispers swelled. To many, Richard's violent end was divine justice, the fitting conclusion to a reign marred by suspicion and blood. The boy prince's disappearance, long a wound in the nation's conscience, was now an unspoken scar overtaken by the spectacle of the fallen king. The Lancastrian Henry Tudor, crowned Henry VII, wasted no time weaving the threads of legitimacy, marrying Elizabeth of York to unite the fractured roses. His reign was heralded as renewal, an epoch rising from ashes and betrayal. Yet beneath this veneer of order, fissures remained. The Yorkist loyalists, though silenced in battle, clung to memory like smoldering embers beneath the snow. Secret murmurs resisted the Tudor narrative, casting Richard not as villain but martyr, a sovereign undone by political machinations rather than personal malice. The grotesque violence of his death, the cruel desecration of his body, became a symbol of the depth to which power could sink, a dark reflection of a kingdom unwilling to confront its own sins. In the public sphere, the execution of Richard became a spectacle whose echoes reverberated through generations. The crowds who had witnessed the battlefield carnage were swept into a ritualistic catharsis, an enactment of vengeance and relief. But many recoiled, horrified by the savagery, the blatant desecration of royal flesh. Chroniclers recorded these reactions with a mixture of fascination and dread, embedding the image of a king undone not just by sword, but by spectacle. Political propaganda flourished. Tudor's agents painted Richard as a monstrous usurper, a figure grotesquely twisted both in body and deed. The curvature of his spine was seized upon as divine punishment, his death portrayed as moral reckoning. This narrative was cemented by Shakespeare's later dramatization, an enduring portrayal that immortalized Richard as villainous hunchback, a figure of malevolence and ruin. The truth was subsumed beneath layers of myth, the albia reality of his violent death smoothed into tragedy and legend. Meanwhile, The humble burial beneath Greyfriars Church became a silent witness to erasure. The modest tombstone was worn to near invisibility, a physical metaphor for the fading of Richard's presence from England's collective memory. The very place where the last Plantagenet king lay was itself swallowed by time, eventually lost beneath streets and buildings, a cityscape indifferent to the grotesque legacy buried below. Yet history has a slow, inexorable way of reclaiming what was discarded. Centuries later, the rediscovery of Richard's remains sparked a profound re-examination. The skeletal evidence shattered centuries of sanitized narrative. The cleaved skull, the halberd wounds, the crushed vertebrae revealed the brutal choreography of his final moments. The science of bones spoke where words had failed, revealing a death not of nobility or mercy, but of savage annihilation. The public reaction to this discovery was complex, a mixture of fascination, horror, and reluctant empathy. For many, the image of the broken king crouched in a pauper's grave humanized a figure once reduced to villainy. Yet the grotesque details of his death also reawakened the darker impulses of political retribution, reminding a modern world that power's collapse often unfolds in violence and erasure. Thus, the immediate aftermath of Richard's death was not a neat conclusion, but a fractured beginning, an interstice where history, myth, and memory collided. The spectacle of his violent fall did not merely end a reign. It inaugurated a legacy fraught with contradiction, a shadow play of martyrdom and monstrosity that would haunt England's consciousness for centuries to come. He was not mourned, he was erased. For centuries, Richard III drifted like a spectre through England's collective imagination, not as a monarch wronged or remembered, but as a cautionary grotesque. His name became a sigil of corruption, his curved spine a shorthand for moral deformity. History, authored by the victors, hollowed him into caricature. In plays, he crawled across stages snarling treachery. In classrooms, he stood as the parable of ambition turned inward, of evil born from imperfection. The truth of his death, its carnality, its humiliation, was eclipsed by performance. But myths cast long shadows, and eventually shadows demand light. The rediscovery of Richard's remains in 2012 beneath a council car park in Leicester marked not just an archaeological marvel, but a resurrection of memory. His bones, exhumed with reverence long denied, whispered a different legacy, one of pain, of shame, and of spectral injustice. Here lay not the monstrous hunchback of Tudor theatre, but a man whose spine, though curved, bore the full weight of a collapsing dynasty. The wounds upon him spoke not of divine vengeance, but of public cruelty, ritualized through steel. His reburial in 2015 was solemn, ceremonial, and, ironically, royal. Nobles, clergy, and the public gathered in mute recognition of a monarch whose death had once been engineered to obliterate meaning. This time, the grave was deep, the coffin of oak, the service steeped in poetry and prayer. Yet even this gesture of restoration carried the taste of irony. For what dignity can burial bestow upon a corpse first displayed like spoils? What sanctity can reinterment reclaim from the halberd's cleaving judgment? Richard's legacy is less a statue than a wound, one reopened with each generation's reckoning. He is the king who ruled briefly, fought fiercely, and died brutally, but more than that, he is the monarch whose corpse became a battleground for truth. His very skeleton became contested ground. Historians, dramatists, scientists, and monarchists, each carving meaning from bone. Some sought to redeem him, others to reinforce the myth, but none could ignore the symbolic gravity of his death. A sovereign butchered into silence, then reborn as symbol. The symbols persist. The crown upon his skull, ripped away not by God but by blade. The crooked spine, once mockery, now re-examined as human frailty made royal. The burial beneath a friary floor, a site forgotten, paved over, desecrated not by intent but by indifference. His story is that of sovereignty made disposable, of power so fragile it can be buried beneath parking lines. Even Shakespeare's Richard, though fictionalized, echoes this enduring horror. The villain demands a horse, screams into the void, is struck down not as a man, but as a monstrosity. And yet, hidden within that performance lies an eternal truth. How a ruler's death becomes not an ending, but a mirror, reflecting the fears, desires, and cruelty of those who survive him. In every generation, Richard becomes what England needs him to be: tyrant, victim, scapegoat, king. There is tragedy in such fluid legacy, not merely because it warps truth, but because it denies rest. Richard III cannot sleep, not in the car park, not in the cathedral. He is summoned again and again, each exhumation of memory peeling back old wounds. He was destroyed in body, disfigured in text, and only partly restored by science. He was never allowed to be only a man. And perhaps that is the final grotesquerie, that death, no matter how absolute, cannot rescue the vilified from myth. Richard's bones may rest beneath sculpted stone, but his story still walks, limps, stumbles through the corridors of history. His final agony, rendered in halberd and shame, has become theatre's curtain and classroom's lesson, but bones do not lie, and his did not flinch. They faced upward, twisted, broken, but defiant, as though even in death he refused the narrative imposed upon him. The tale of Richard III did not end with death. It metastasized into legend, into propaganda, into the subconscious of a nation. He haunts England not as a ghost in chains, but as a deeper, more intimate spectre. The king beneath the car park, the monarch whose story was amputated and stitched anew by those who needed him monstrous. Long after his sword had fallen, his memory was made to kneel. The Tudors, rising from the smouldering corpse of Plantagenet ambition, understood the power of narrative better than any regime before them. In Richard's bones, they found a cautionary fable. In his defeat, they built a throne. The new dynasty's survival depended not just on victory, but on moral justification, and so Richard became a vessel into which every sin was poured. Fratricide, regicide, tyranny, the murder of children. He became the king who was unfit to reign, whose crown was stolen by Providence itself. This was no accident. It was design. Thomas More laid the first bricks. Shakespeare built the fortress. Together, they crafted a Richard shaped by ideology, not inquiry. Twisted of spine and soul, he emerged from their pens as a man whose very body betrayed him, a grotesque avatar of illegitimacy. The stage bent his form until his deeds felt inevitable. Audiences cheered his downfall. Schoolboys studied his cunning. The real Richard, with his law-making reforms, his loyalty to the North, his complicated humanity, was left behind, dissolved in ink and myth. But lies leave residue. And England, centuries later, began to feel the itch of doubt. When archaeologists lifted his bones from the earth, they also lifted a veil. His scoliosis was real, yes, but not the hunchback of caricature. There were no withered limbs, no clawed hands. His wounds, preserved in the silence of the grave, spoke not of divine punishment, but of calculated mutilation. His skull bore a cleaving that could only have been inflicted after his helmet was removed. Ritual, not combat. His spine twisted in defiance of straight histories. His pelvis, punctured, suggested humiliation. These were not just injuries. They were messages. Each stab was a sentence. Each hack, a paragraph. Each blow said, "This man will not be remembered as king. This man will not be mourned. This man will be erased." But history has a way of speaking through silence, and Richard's silence, exhumed, became a roar. For the British public, his reburial was a reckoning. A nation that once celebrated his death now gathered to honor his bones. A coffin of seasoned oak, a solemn procession. Clergy who once cursed his name now prayed over it. In Leicester Cathedral, beneath soft light and sculpted stone, the maligned monarch was laid to rest, not as the villain, but as the king. The ceremony was not exoneration, it was acknowledgement that history can be crueler than any blade. And yet even now, Richard's image flickers. To some, he remains the usurper, the shadowy regent who vanished his nephews. To others, he is a scapegoat, scorched by Tudor politics and bardic imagination. He is debated in books, portrayed on stages, dissected in documentaries. His legacy will not settle, will not harden into certainty. Because Richard III represents something larger than himself, the fragility of truth in the hands of power, the ease with which a corpse can be weaponized, the terrifying idea that death is not the end, but the beginning of a second, often crueler life. One lived as symbol. He stands now in the haunted halls of collective memory, a crooked figure both cursed and crowned. His name conjures questions more than answers, fear more than fact. He is not remembered, he is relived over and over, not as a man of flesh and ambition, but as a mirror. And what England sees in that mirror changes with every age. His body rests, but his story walks. And perhaps this is the final cruelty, or the final justice, that those who silenced him made him eternal, that in trying to reduce him to a monster, they created a myth too complex to kill, that in hiding his bones beneath concrete and shadow, they only delayed their voice. For when they were unearthed, when that spine, those wounds, that silent scream rose into light, the story changed, not erased, not rewritten, but reopened. And some wounds, never truly close. There are kings remembered for their glory. There are kings remembered for their cruelty. And then there is Richard, remembered not for what he did, but for what others said he did. He died in a muddy field, but he lived in the mouths of liars. And there, his true suffering began. For centuries, Richard III was no longer a man. He was a morality play in royal costume, a broken creature with a twisted back and a twisted heart, haunting school books, theaters, and sermons. But under every legend, there is a body. And under every body, there is a truth that refuses to stay buried. In 2012, beneath a council car park in Leicester, diggers touched bone. Time blinked, and England found itself face to face with a ghost it had slandered for 500 years. Richard's skeleton lay in a shallow grave. Curved spine arched like a final protest, his skull split open, his ribs cracked, his pelvis pierced from behind. There was no coffin, no ceremony, no honor. The last Plantagenet had been dumped in the earth like a secret no one wanted found, but found he was. His rediscovery was not just archaeological, it was spiritual, political, psychological. DNA confirmed his identity. Forensics confirmed his wounds. But the nation had to confront something deeper. What if the villain was never a villain at all? What if the monster we were told to hate was just a man devoured by myth? The car park was no accident. It was poetry. Richard had been driven into the dirt by a new dynasty buried beneath layers of concrete, tarmac, and history. And yet, centuries later, the earth gave him back. Not with rage, but with quiet truth. No longer was he just the hunchback king of Shakespeare's venom. No longer just the child killer of Tudor whispers. He was a man, a king whose body still remembered what the kingdom forgot. And yet, as the cathedral filled with mourners in 2015, some found it difficult to know what they were mourning. A victim, a villain, a symbol of narrative gone wrong, or simply the tragic idea that history is not truth, but performance. Richard's reburial was stately, solemn, gentle. It was everything his death was not. And in that contradiction, his redemption began. But redemption is not the same as justice, because Richard's true punishment was not Bosworth, it was what came after. It was the centuries spent as a grotesque, his spine twisted for theatre, his heart blackened for story, his memory butchered for power. They killed him once, and then they killed him again with every line, every play, every history book that did not ask, who was he really? He was not the only king to fall in battle, but he is perhaps the only one whose soul was smothered under the weight of someone else's pen. That is the crown beneath the pavement, not gold, not glory, but the quiet revelation that truth is fragile and the dead are defenseless. Even now his legacy splits opinion. To some he is still the cold, ambitious killer of princes. To others he is the last loyal Plantagenet, betrayed by men and myth alike. But maybe that's the point. Maybe Richard was both, or neither. Maybe Richard III is a reflection, a question we keep asking ourselves. What do we want our kings to be? And what do we need our enemies to become? The pavement in Leicester is smooth now. No bones lie beneath it, but every footstep carries weight, because under that spot a man was erased. And then, piece by piece, he returned. He returned through soil and science. He returned through silence and sorrow. He returned not to take back the crown, but to show us what it cost him. And now, we must decide what kind of kingdom builds its future on a grave that once had no name. Richard III is dead, but the story is still alive, and it waits, not in palaces, but in archives, in textbooks, in the shifting conscience of a country that once buried a king like trash, and centuries later dug him up like treasure. In the end, Richard did not rise again as a monarch. He rose as a question, a whisper through the corridors of time, asking not for revenge, but for remembrance. History is not written in ink, it is carved in scars, and Richard bore his quietly, in the curve of his spine, the fracture in his skull, and the silence that followed him into the grave. He was a king devoured by storytelling, buried beneath centuries of comfortable lies. A villain manufactured for the convenience of a crown, and when he died, he took with him the truth of an age that feared what it could not explain. But beneath the concrete, beneath the car park, beneath the myth, was a man. And in finding his bones, we found something greater, the fragility of history, the violence of narrative, and the haunting truth that even kings can vanish, not with a scream, but with a whisper no one hears. They took his crown. They took his name, but they could not take his shadow. And now, as we walk over the very ground that once held him, we are no longer trampling a villain. We are treading on memory. And memory, no matter how buried, always rises.